Hello comrades and welcome back to the Soviet vlog. The topic of today's video is nationalism in Ukraine, and we will talk about relations between Russians and Ukrainians mostly during the Soviet Union, during the period that I remember. Someone asked that question in my previous video when I touched the topic of racism, which there's I think quite a difference between racism and nationalism. So, for example, I see the way racism is relations, mostly negative kind of type of relations between different races. So you're talking about whites and blacks, or Asians, we'll call them sometimes yellow in Soviet Union, yellow people. When the nationalism is pretty much the same race, but then you have a different nationalities and how they interact between themselves. So I would say maybe like in case of Africa, there'll be different nations on the continent. In case of Soviet Union, the closest three nations, Slavic nations, there'll be Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. So I will share my memories, what I remember about relations between mostly Russians and Ukrainians back in the Soviet days. Well, first of all, you need to understand that I myself, as a perfect product of the Soviet system, looking back and thinking about it, I'm like a Toyota Prius. I'm hybrid because I am. I mentioned many times. I thought about myself first of all as a Soviet person, so I'm a Soviet person of Ukrainian nationality, and what that meant actually that I'm a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. My first language was always Russian. So this is kind of really, I would say, weird situation. As I said, I'm like a hybrid person. I'm Ukrainian national that speaks Russian. And like my parents, both Ukrainians, although they came from different areas in Ukraine, so they spoke different Ukrainian dialect, you say. My dad is more like from western area, central west, so Zhytomyr region. So they had a kind of the different dialect or accent. And my mom came from northern Ukraine, which was heavily impacted mostly by Belarusian language and some Russian. So she used a lot of words that not really Ukrainian words. But when my parents moved in Kiev, they both switched to Russian language. So I grew up as a Russian-speaking person. And of course, the fact that I attended Russian-speaking schools also had a huge impact. So this is what was going on in my case. So let's talk about, first of all, what was going on in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, during the Soviet times. If I recall correctly, most signage in Kiev was in Russian. So the stores, gastronomes, univermags, all the grocery stores, most of them were in Russian. Some of them were in Ukrainian, so I'm not sure if those are some kind of standard or what, but we had stores that called мясо, which means meat, and sometimes it would be мясо with the little like apostrophe, which meant it's in Ukrainian, same word. But if I remember correctly, most signs were in Russian. Same with announcement of public transportation. For example, in subway or on tramways, there's only places that we actually had like announcement about what is the name of the next stop. On the bus, like you're supposed to know what is the next stop, there was no announcement, but on subway train and tramway, there'll be pre-recorded announcement. This is the stop, Gnata Yuri, for example. The next stop is whatever the name of the next stop, and it'll be announced in Russian. So that's just kind of interesting. So you have a capital of Ukraine, which most signage is in Russian and most public transportation announcements in Russian. Similar situation was with schools, colleges, and kindergartens. I attended, several schools. So I went in one on Chokolovka, number 69, and I studied there for 3 years. Then we moved, so I changed school, and all three schools I attended were Russian speaking. So all the subjects were taught in Russian, all the books were in Russian, except the classes of Ukrainian languages and Ukrainian literature, those were of course in Ukrainian. And honestly, I didn't look up, but it was hard to find Ukrainian language school. So the school that everything is taught in Ukrainian in Kiev. So you have a capital of Ukraine that hardly had any schools that teach in the native Ukrainian language. So that was really bizarre. And in fact, when situation changed after Ukraine became an independent country, is that I have hard time helping my little brother, because after switch to Ukrainian language, I didn't know the terms like math terms, physics terms, chemistry terms. I was totally confused because I didn't know in Ukrainian how to say all the terms in math. So that was quite a weird experience when I couldn't help my brother because I couldn't understand what he was talking about. Now, if we zoom out and we'll say take a look like a big picture of Ukraine generally and its Ukrainian history, I don't want to get in a lot of details, but Ukraine had a really complicated history. It's one of those unlucky countries that always had really powerful and aggressive neighbors. So we had Poland to the west and Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then we had Russia to the east. So Ukraine was constantly being almost like grinded between those powerful states. So Western Ukraine was mostly under control of Poland or Austro-Hungarian empires for centuries, and then Eastern Ukraine was under Russian influence. So it's definitely like almost two different countries that now is one country. So it's a huge difference between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. Then, if you look down south, we have Crimea, which is a totally separate story. We always had horrible history with Tatars who used to live in Crimean Peninsula. They were always raiding Ukraine and taking slaves and stuff like that. So for centuries, we had really bad relations with Crimea. And then Crimea became part of Ukraine in 1954 when Khrushchev did this symbolical transfer in order to celebrate 300 years of Russia taking over Ukraine pretty much. And as to celebrate that event, he I don't know say that word, by administration, he turned Crimea into under Ukrainian control, but technically it was still part of USSR, so that was not a big deal at all. Like there was no manifestations in Moscow protesting against transferring Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine. And of course, another ugly page of history of Crimea is that after World War II, all Tatars were like almost overnight put on a train and sent to Siberia or Asia, and then they moved a lot of Russian people to take over the Crimean Peninsula. Like there was some kind of incentives offered if you moved down to Crimea. So pretty much overnight, Stalin changed the population from mostly Tatar people to mostly Russian people. And I think it's one of the reasons Crimea was always like artificial part of that didn't belong really to Ukraine, because population was mostly Russian that came in after World War II. When I grew up in Kiev, many of my friends were Russians. I can't even tell you, maybe 50%, if not more. And it was really not a big deal. Would never make a difference for me who I play with outside, was Russian kids or Ukrainian kids. We all spoke Russian. But quite a few of my best friends were actually Russians. They were from the military families. So those, like officers, they were moved around the country quite often. And so I had people that my friends, that their parents got assigned to be in Kiev for their military duties, and they get apartment and they attend the local schools. And the only way I actually knew they're Russians is because they wore different uniforms. Like in Russia, it was a dark blue color uniform for pupils, for kids going to school. In Ukraine, it was a brown one. So they wore blue uniforms because they brought it from Russian schools, and they didn't study Ukrainian language. Like there was a system that if your parents are military Russian personnel, they weren't required to study local language. So if you're in Ukraine, you're not required to study Ukrainian. If you're in Kazakhstan or Baltics, you're not required to study local languages. So all you need to do is just sign a paper. And so I was kind of envy because I had to sit in class and study Ukrainian language while my friends were just hanging out outside waiting for next class because they didn't have to study Ukrainian language or literature. So now if we talk about general policy, government policy, the whole idea was that one country, one people. So there was kind of like a Sovietization, which was pretty much like Russification. I'm a product of that I'm a Russian speaking Ukrainian person that always consider myself Soviet first. So I think all those things that happened in Kiev were a direct result of the Moscow policies, although it depended a lot on the local leader. And there's a quite interesting event happened. I remember reading about it. So when Brezhnev was the general secretary of Soviet Union, at the same time, our local general secretary of Ukrainian Communist Party, which this is a bizarre thing that local party leaders were actual leaders of the republics or country. So when Brezhnev arrived to Kiev with a visit, and I believe he arrived by train. So he was met on a train station, train station in Kiev by, girls dressed in national Ukrainian costumes. They presented Brezhnev with this traditional Ukrainian bread and salt and the girls were talking in Ukrainian, greeting Brezhnev in Ukrainian, singing Ukrainian songs. And so then later Brezhnev asked Sherbitsky, like he was really surprised, and he's like, "Why do you all guys speak in Ukrainian?" And Sherbitsky looked at him and said, "Comrade Brezhnev, do you expect us to speak Chinese? You arrived to Ukraine, we speak Ukrainian here." So that was famous. He was quite a guy, Comrade Sherbitsky. And it was one thing he did is he actually pushed back on Brezhnev, and there's a silly question, why do you guys speak Ukrainian here? So the only time I could hear Ukrainian language would be actually on radio. So the local Ukrainian stations were transmitting or having programs in Ukrainian. Then we had two Ukrainian TV channels, which were in Ukrainian, most of it, and some local newspapers. There were Ukrainian language newspapers. Otherwise, as I said, it was really bizarre if you were on the street or in the bus on public transportation and you hear someone speaking Ukrainian. It was kind of weird. Like I hardly ever met a person on the street speaking Ukrainian in the capital of Ukraine. On the radio station, yes. On TV, yes. But in real life, if someone, asking you some question in Ukrainian, he's probably came from Western Ukraine because, no one speaks Ukrainian here in the capital of Ukraine. How weird is that? Now, if we talk about nationalism and maybe kind of like some problems between Russians and Ukrainians, the only kind of silly things I remember is when I became older, like I was not a young boy anymore and I started kind of looking at girls. My mom started talking to me, those mother talks, parent talks about look for the right person, look for the right girl. So one thing she was mentioning, and that's kind of, I would put it in the category of nationalism, like she was saying Seryoja, which is, like a kid form of Sergey name, you should look for Ukrainian girl. The Ukrainian girls, they work harder, they cook better, they have the same mentality as you do. Russian girls they tend to be lazy, they may be pretty, but they don't like to cook and they're lazy. So if you're thinking about dating someone for marriage, you probably should consider Ukrainian girls. So that was kind of a silly thing for me to hear, but I remember mom kind of talking to me that way. My first experience of Russian nationalism was in quite unusual circumstances, and it's just because it was quite a shock to me. I remember it quite vividly. So one of my friends was getting married. So he came back from army. So I would say it was probably 1990, maybe So 88, yeah, about 1990. So right before the Soviet Union went belly up, he was actually Russian, marrying Ukrainian girl. So we all knew he's Russian, but he was a good friend of mine. He's from Murom area in Russia. I'm not sure how come that his parents moved to Kiev, but so we were getting ready for marriage. Well, he was getting ready, so we were attending his wedding. And of course, there were quite a few his relatives arrived from Murom, from Russia. And there was this young guy, his like cousin, I remember. He was quite young, and he came, besides attending his relative wedding, he also came on a mission to have sex with Ukrainian girl. So I found it really bizarre. For example, if I would go to Moscow, you know, and or if I'll go to United States, all of us America may be different. Like, okay, I want to experience sex with American girl. But in this case, like if we're talking about same country like Soviet Union, if I go to Moscow, I'll maybe be like interested. Okay, I'll be interested, to have sex with Moscow girl. And it's not like doesn't matter like what nationality, just local girl because maybe they have this whatever different. This guy, and that's why I kind of got a little bit upset, I would say, because he wasn't about like I want to have sex with local girl, like from a girl from Kiev. No, he was specifically saying, like to me, which I'm Ukrainian, I want to have sex with Hakhlushka, which I'll talk about it a second later. We had this like a little bit derogative names for nationalities. So Ukrainians had a nickname Chachol, and of course, if you're a female, you Hakhlushka. Now Russian will be Katsap or Katsapka. So he was specifically saying, I would like to bang Hakhlushka. And he was just like constantly repeating that, like, that's my mission. And he was like so boldly into it, like he's telling Ukrainian friends of his relative, like, hey, do you know anyone who will be like easy lay? Because I promise my buddies I will bang the Hakhlushka. And that was really like not cool. It's the first time I was like, who cares like what nationality the girl is? But for him it was very important that she must be Ukrainian girl. So there was like a dominance thing or whatever. But that's the first time when I just kind of like, this is a really weird attitude for like from Russian person, but Russian person from Russia, that it's very important that I need to have sex with Ukrainian girl. And he tried really hard during the wedding. He was hitting really hard on this one girl. I'm not sure if he succeeded or not, but that was my first like impression. Now I notice, since there's online forums and there's a lot of tension going on between Russia and Ukraine, so it's like a big deal for Russians to say something like, yeah, your Ukrainian girls come to Russia now to work as a prostitutes, so we're banging your girls, so that's like dominance thing. So I see that's like that was a precursor for that is back in 90's that the Russian guy came to Ukraine with the mission, I need to bang the Ukrainian girl. And of course, and as always as a neighboring countries, we had jokes about each other. So there was a lot of anecdotes, jokes about Ukrainians, Hachols, and like we are really sneaky, dumb, and we like pork fat, salo. So that was like these key jokes about Ukrainians. Now Katsapi, or the other word we use, Moskal, which is more like historical word. Moskal is more means like soldier. So when during its Tsar regime, Tsar Russia, when they drafted you in the army, they will say like, yeah, they shaved you into Moskal, so you'll be a soldier Moskal for the next 25 years. So the jokes about Russians will be that they're drunk, they dumb, they really generous, like they will give anything away, but mostly like they stupid and they constant drunk and they will do anything for vodka. And then of course our third brother from Belarus, nickname was Bulbash, and mostly jokes were that they all about potatoes, because it's all they like planted and grew in Belarus, potatoes. So all the jokes will be all the humor about them and being addicted to potatoes. So this is kind of, I remember what the humor was. But it was kind of friendly. I won't say it was anything mean. I mean, we'll have a jokes. Okay, so there's this maybe American, Ukrainian, and Russian go and they get in some situation, and how the Ukrainian deals with that, how Russians deal with that based on their national attributes, and then how the American, of course, will be doing it all stupid, complicated way, and he always got beaten by Ukrainian and Russian. Another small interesting detail, when I went with my class to Riga, which is Latvia, one of the Baltic states, and that happened, I believe, in 1987. So that was like exchange program. We went to Riga and we stayed in local school in the summer, and stayed for like a week. And the same that one class from Riga went to Ukraine and stayed in our school. There was rumors that if you talk Russian in Riga, they won't help you. So for example, if you go to the store and you ask to buy something and you speak Russian, they're just going to ignore you. I just remember that because when I went there and I was trying to buy things, I was asking for in Ukrainian to purchase things, but then we tried in Russian and it worked. We had no one gave us any attitude. So after that, we just were speaking Russian and dealing in Russian, and we had no issues. But I was surprised to meet quite a few older people who spoke Russian like really strong accent. That was really bizarre, because Baltic states were part of Soviet Union for 50 years, and these people still speaking Russian with such a strong foreign accent. So that was weird. And of course now, since Ukraine is independent since 1991, a lot of things changed. Like I come to Ukraine and it almost feels like I come into the foreign country because everything is in Ukrainian. And I remember days when some nationalists, Ukrainian nationalists, in the beginning of the 90s were attempting to raise the yellow and blue and yellow, to say more correctly, flag in the front of the government building in Kiev, and the cops chased them away and ripped that flag down. Now walk it, there's a blue and yellow flag up there. A lot of people speak Ukrainian. All the signage is in Ukrainian. Public transportation, everything in Ukrainian. So it really I'm a foreigner now from my own home country, but a lot of things changed since 1991. Well, I hope you enjoyed another long and boring video from Comrade Sergey. I hope I maybe help you to understand better the situation with relations between Slavic nations of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And as you probably noticed, I don't know if you see it, but YouTube is really mean when it comes to videos touching these topics like racism and nationalism. So they cut my monetization right away. So if you feel these videos are useful and they need to be out there, I really appreciate your support. You can just forward a couple of dollars via PayPal and support my efforts to tell you more about life in Soviet Union. Well, this is the end of my story. I'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye. And if you love my channel and would like to show your support, please click on the link below this video and become the patron of the USHANKA show. For as little as $1, you can help us grow and create the new, interesting videos about the life in Soviet Union.